In our first installment of Parnassus on Wheels by Christopher Morley, we met our protagonist, Helen McGill, who is housekeeper to her brother, a great writer but a very poor farmer. A book peddler, Roger Mifflin, visits the farm one day, and Helen decides to purchase his wagon and have some adventures of her own away from the farm. Mr. Mifflin offers to ride with her for a day or two to show her the ropes. I'm Pat Tully of the Ketchikan Public Library, and this is Reading Aloud. Chapter 4. Just out of sight of the farm, the road forks, one way running on to Walton, where you cross the river by a covered bridge, the other swinging down toward Greenbrier and Port Vigor. Mrs. Collins lives a mile or so up the Walton Road, and as I very often run over to see her, I thought Andrew would be most likely to look for me there. So, after we had passed through the grove, I took the right-hand turn to Greenbrier. We began the long ascent over Huckleberry Hill, and as I smelt the fresh autumn odor of the leaves, I chuckled a little. Mr. Mifflin seemed in a perfect ecstasy of high spirits. "This is certainly grand," he said. "Lord, I applaud your spunk. Do you think Mr. McGill will give you chase?" "I haven't an idea," I said. "Not right away, anyhow. He's so used to my settled ways that I don't think he'll suspect anything till he finds my note. I wonder what kind of story Mrs. McNally will tell." "How about putting him off the scent?" he said. "Give me your handkerchief." I did so. He hopped nimbly out, ran back down the hill. He was a spry little person in spite of his bald crown, and dropped the handkerchief on the Walton Road about 100 feet beyond the fork. Then he followed me up the slope. "There," he said, grinning like a kid, "that'll fool him. The sage of Redfield will undoubtedly follow a false spoor, and the criminals will win a good start. But I'm afraid it's rather easy to follow a craft as unusual as Parnassus." "Tell me how you manage the thing," I said. "Do you really make it pay?" We halted at the top of the hill to give Pegasus a breathing space. The terrier lay down in the dust and watched us gravely. Mr. Mifflin pulled out a pipe and begged my permission to smoke. "It's rather comical how I first got into it," he said. "I was a school teacher down in Maryland. I'd been plugging away in a country school for years, on a starvation salary. I was trying to support an invalid mother and put by something in case of storms. I remember how I used to wonder whether I'd ever be able to wear a suit that wasn't shabby and have my shoes polished every day. Then my health went back on me. The doctor told me to get into the open air. By and by, I got this idea of a traveling bookstore. I had always been a lover of books, and in the days when I boarded out among the farmers, I used to read aloud to them. After my mother died, I built a wagon to suit my own ideas, bought a stock of books from a big second-hand store in Baltimore, and set out. Parnassus just about saved my life, I guess." He pushed his faded old cap back on his head and relit his pipe. I clicked to Pegasus, and we rumbled gently off over the upland, looking down across the pastures. Distant cowbells sounded tankle-tonk among the bushes. Across the slope of the hill, I could see the road winding away to Redfield. Somewhere along the road, Andrew would be rolling back toward home and roast pork with applesauce. And here was I, setting out on the first madness of my life without even a qualm. "Miss McGill," said the little man, "this rolling pavilion has been wife, doctor, and religion to me for 7 years. A month ago I would have scoffed at the thought of leaving her. But somehow it's come over me, I need a change. There's a book I've been yearning to write for a long time, and I need a desk steady under my elbows and a roof over my head. And silly as it seems, I'm crazy to get back to Brooklyn. My brother and I used to live there as kids. Think of walking over the old bridge at sunset and seeing the towers of Manhattan against a red sky, and those old gray cruisers down in the Navy Yard. You don't know how tickled I am to sell out. I've sold a lot of copies of your brother's books, and I've often thought he'd be the man to buy Parnassus if I got tired of her." "So he would," I said, "just the man. He'd be only too likely to, and go maundering about in this jaunty car and neglect the farm." "But tell me about selling books. How much profit do you make out of it? We'll be passing Mrs. Mason's farm by and by, and we might as well sell her something just to make a start." "It's very simple," he said. "I replenish my stock whenever I go through a big town. There's always a second-hand bookstore about somewhere where you can pick up odds and ends. And every now and then I write to a wholesaler in New York for some stuff. When I buy a book, I mark in the back just what I paid for it. Then I know what I can afford to sell it for. See here." He pulled up a book from behind the seat. A copy of Lorna Doone it was, and showed me the letters A and M scrawled in pencil in the back. "That means I paid 10 cents for this. Now if you sell it for a quarter, you've got a safe profit. It costs me about $4 a week to run Parnassus, generally less. If you clear that much in 6 days, you can afford to lay off on Sundays." "How do you know that AM stands for 10 cents?" I asked. "The code word's manuscript. Each letter stands for a figure from 0 up to 9, see?" He scrawled it down on a scrap of paper. "Now, you see, AM stands for 10, AN would be 12, NS would be 24, AC is 15, AMM is $1, and so on. I don't pay much over 50 cents for books as a rule, because country folks are shy of paying much for them. They'll pay a lot for a separator or a buggy top, but they've never been taught to worry about literature. But it's surprising how excited they get about books if you sell them the right kind. Over beyond Port Vigor, there's a farmer who's waiting for me to go back. I've been there 3 or 4 times, and he'll buy about $5 worth if I know him. First time I went there, I sold him Treasure Island, and he's been talking about it yet. I sold him Robinson Crusoe and Little Women for his daughter, and Huck Finn, and Grubb's book about the potato. Last time I was there, he wanted some Shakespeare, but I wouldn't give it to him. I didn't think he was up to it yet." I began to see something of the little man's idealism in his work. He was a kind of traveling missionary in his way. A hefty talker, too. His eyes were twinkling now, and I could see him warming up. "Lord," he said, "when you sell a man a book, you don't sell him just 12 ounces of paper and ink and glue. You sell him a whole new life. Love and friendship and humor and ships at sea by night. There's all heaven and earth in a book. A real book, I mean. Jiminy, if I were the baker or the butcher or the broom huckster, people would run to the gate when I came by, just waiting for my stuff. And here I go loaded with everlasting salvation. Yes, ma'am, salvation for their little stunted minds. And it's hard to make 'em see it. That's what makes it worthwhile. I'm doing something that nobody else from Nazareth, Maine to Walla Walla, Washington has ever thought of. It's a new field, but by the bones of Whitman, it's worthwhile. That's what this country needs, more books." He laughed at his own vehemence. "Do you know it's comical," he said. "Even the publishers, the fellows that print the books, can't see what I'm doing for them. Some of them refuse me credit because I sell their books for what they're worth, instead of for the prices they mark on them. They write me letters about price maintenance, and I write back about merit maintenance. Publish a good book, and I'll get a good price for it, say I. Sometimes I think the publishers know less about books than anyone else. I guess that's natural, though. Most school teachers don't know much about children. The best of it is," he went on, "I have such a darn good time. Peg and Bach, that's the dog, and I go loafing along the road on a warm summer day, and by we'll fetch up alongside some boarding house, and there are the boarders all rocking off their lunch on the veranda. Most of 'em bored to death, nothing good to read, nothing to do but sit and watch the flies buzzing in the sun, and the chickens rubbing up and down in the dust. First thing you know, I'll sell 'em half a dozen books that put the love of life into them, and they won't forget Parnassus in a hurry. Take O. Henry, for instance. There isn't anybody so doggone sleepy that he won't enjoy that man's stories. He understood life, you bet, and he could write it down with all its little twists. I've spent an evening reading O. Henry and Wilkie Collins to people and had them buy out all their books I had and clamor for more. What do you do in winter, I ask, a practical question, as most of mine are. That depends on where I am when bad weather sets in, said Mr. Mifflin. 2 winters I was down south and managed to keep Parnassus going all through the season. Otherwise, I just lay up wherever I am. I've never found it hard to get lodging for Peg and a job for myself, if I had to have them. Last winter I worked in a bookstore in Boston. Winter before, I was in a country drugstore down in Pennsylvania. Winter before that, I tutored a couple of small boys in English literature. Winter before that, I was a steward on a steamer. You see how it goes. I've had a fairly miscellaneous experience. As far as I can see, a man who's fond of books need never starve. But this winter I'm planning to live with my brother in Brooklyn and slog away at my book. Lord, how I've pondered over that thing. Long summer afternoons I've sat here, jogging along in the dust, thinking it out until it seemed as though my forehead would burst. You see, my idea is that the common people, in the country that is, never have had any chance to get hold of books, and never have anyone to explain what books can mean. It's all right for college presidents to draw up their 5-foot shelves of great literature, and for the publishers to advertise sets of their linoleum classics. But what the people need is good, homely, honest stuff. Something that'll stick to their ribs, make 'em laugh and tremble and feel sick to think of the littleness of this popcorn ball spinning in space without ever even getting a hot box. And something that'll spur 'em on to keep the hearth well swept and the woodpile split into kindling and the dishes washed and dried and put away. Anyone who can get the country people to read something worthwhile is doing his nation a real service. And that's what this caravan of culture aspires to. You must be weary of this harangue. Does the sage of Redfield ever run on like that? Not to me, I said. He's known me so long that he thinks of me as a kind of animated bread baking and cake mixing machine. I guess he doesn't put much stock in my judgment in literary matters. But he puts his digestion in my hands without reserve. There's Mason's farm over there. I guess we better sell him some books, hadn't we? Just for a starter. We turned into the lane that runs up to the Mason farmhouse. Bach trotted along ahead, very stiff on his legs and his tail gently wagging, to interview the mastiff, and Mrs. Mason, who was sitting on the porch peeling potatoes, laid down the pan. She's a big, buxom woman with jolly brown eyes like a cow's. For heaven's sake, Miss McGill, she called out in a cheerful voice, I'm glad to see you. Got a lift, did you? She hadn't really noticed the inscription on Parnassus and thought it was a regular huckster's wagon. Well, Mrs. Mason, I said, I've gone into the book business. This is Mr. Mifflin. I've bought out his stock. We've come to sell you some books. She laughed. Go on, Helen, she said. You can't kid me. I bought a whole set of books last year from an agent. The world's great funeral orations, 20 volumes. Sam and I ain't read more than the first volume yet. It's awful uneasy reading. Mifflin jumped down and raised the side flap of the wagon. Mrs. Mason came closer. I was tickled to see how the little man perked up at the sight of a customer. Evidently, selling books was meat and drink to him. Madam, he said, funeral orations, bound in sackcloth, I suppose, have their place. But Miss McGill and I have got some real books here, to which I invite your attention. Winter will be here soon, and you will need something more cheerful to beguile your evenings. Very possibly you have growing children who would profit by a good book or two. A book of fairy tales for the little girl I see on the porch? Or stories of inventors for that boy who is about to break his neck jumping from the barn loft? Or a book about road making for your husband? Surely there's something here you need. Miss McGill probably knows your tastes. That little red-bearded man was surely a born salesman. How he guessed that Mr. Mason was the road commissioner in our township, goodness only knows. Perhaps it was just a lucky shot. By this time, most of the family had gathered around the van, and I saw Mr. Mason coming around the barn with his 12-year-old Billy. "Sam," shouted Mrs. Mason, "here's Miss McGill turned to book peddler, and got a preacher with her." "Hello, Miss McGill," said Mr. Mason. He is a big, slow-moving man of great gravity and solidity. "Where's Andrew?" "Andrew's coming home for roast pork and applesauce," I said, "and I'm going off to sell books for a living. Mr. Mifflin here is teaching me how. We've got a book on road mending that's just what you need." I saw Mr. and Mrs. Mason exchange glances. Evidently they thought me crazy. I began to wonder whether we had made a mistake in calling on people I knew so well. The situation was a trifle embarrassing. Mr. Mifflin came to the rescue. "Don't be alarmed, sir," he said to Mr. Mason. "I haven't kidnapped Miss McGill." As he is about half my size, this was amusing. "We are trying to increase her brother's income by selling his books for him. As a matter of fact, we have a wager with him that we can sell 50 copies of Happiness and Hayseed before Halloween. Now, I'm sure your sporting instinct will assist us in taking at least one copy. Andrew McGill is probably the greatest author in this state, and every taxpayer ought to possess his books. May I show you a copy?" "That sounds reasonable," said Mr. Mason, and he almost smiled. "What do you say, Emma? Think we'd better buy a book or two? You know those funeral orations." "Well," said Emma, "you know we've always said we ought to read one of Andrew McGill's books, but we didn't rightly know how to get hold of one. That fellow who sold us the funeral speeches didn't seem to know about 'em. I tell you what, you folks better stop and have dinner with us, and you can tell us what we ought to buy. I'm just ready to put potatoes on the stove now." I must confess that the prospect of sitting down to a meal I hadn't cooked myself appealed to me strongly, and I was keen to see what kind of grub Mrs. Mason provided for her household. But I was afraid that if we dallied there too long, Andrew would be after us. I was about to say that we would have to be getting on, and couldn't stay, but apparently the zest of expounding his philosophy to new listeners was too much for Mifflin. I heard him saying, "That's mighty kind of you, Mrs. Mason, and we'd very much like to stay. Perhaps I can put Peg up in your barn for a while. Then I can tell you all about our books." And to my amazement, I found myself chiming in with assent. Mifflin certainly surpassed himself at dinner. The fact that Mrs. Mason's hot biscuits tasted of saleratus gave me far less satisfaction than it otherwise would, because I was absorbed in listening to this little vagabond's talk. Mr. Mason came to the table grumbling something about his telephone being out of order. I wondered whether he had been trying to get Andrew on the wire. He was a little afraid I was being run away with, I think. But he was soon won over by the current of the little man's cheery wit. Nothing daunted Mifflin. He talked to the old grandmother about quilts, offered to cut a strip off his necktie for her new patchwork, and told us all about the illustrated book on quilts that he had in the van. He discussed cookery and the Bible with Mrs. Mason, and she, being a leading light in the Greenbrier Sunday School, was pleasantly scandalized by his account of the best detective stories in the Old Testament. With Mr. Mason, he was all scientific farming, chemical manures, macadam roads, and crop rotation, and to little Billy, who sat next to him, he told extraordinary yarns about Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, Kit Carson, Buffalo Bill, and whatnot. Honestly, I was amazed at the little man. He was as genial as a cricket on the hearth, and yet every now and then his earnestness would break through. I don't wonder he was a success at selling books. That man could sell clothespins or Paris garters, I guess, and make them seem romantic. "You know, Mr. Mason," he said, "you certainly owe it to these youngsters of yours to put a few really good books into their hands. City kids have libraries to go to, but in the country there's only old Doc Hostetter's almanac and the letters written by ladies with backache telling how Baruna did for them. Give this boy and girl of yours a few good books, and you're starting them on the double-track, block signal line to happiness. Now there's Little Women. That girl of yours can learn more about real girlhood and fine womanhood out of that book than from a year's paper dolls in the attic. That's right, Pa, assented Mrs. Mason. Go on with your meal, Professor. The meat'll get cold. She was completely won by the traveling bookseller, and had given him the highest title of honor in her ken. Why, I read that story when I was a girl, and I still remember it. That's better reading for Dorothy than those funeral speeches, I reckon. I believe the professor's right. We ought to have more books laying around. Seems kind of a shame with a famous author at the next farm not to read more, don't it now? So by the time we got down to Mrs. Mason's squash pie, good pie too, I admit, but her hand is a little heavy for pastry, the whole household was enthusiastic about books, and the atmosphere was literary enough for even Dr. Eliot to live in without panting. Mrs. Mason opened up her parlor, and we sat there while Mifflin recited The Revenge and Maud Muller. Well now, ain't that real sweet, said Emma Mason. It's surprising how those words rhyme so nicely. Seems almost as though it were done a purpose. Reminds me of a piece day at school. There was a mighty pretty piece I learned called The Wreck of the Espress, and she subsided into a genteel melancholy. I saw that Mr. Mifflin was well astride his hobby. He had started to tell the children about Robin Hood, but I had the sense to give him a wink. We had to be getting along, or surely Andrew might be on us. So while Mifflin was putting Pegasus into the shafts again, I picked out 7 or 8 books that I thought would fit the needs of the Masons. Mr. Mason insisted that Happiness and Hayseed be included among them, and gave me a crisp $5 bill, refusing any change. No, he said. I've had more fun than I get at a Grange meeting. Come round again, Miss McGill. I'm going to tell Andrew what a good show this traveling theater of yours gives. And you, Professor, any time you're here about road mending season, stop in and tell me some more good advice. Well, I must get back to the field. Bach fell in under the van, and we creaked off along the lane. Mifflin filled his pipe and was chuckling to himself. I was a little worried now for fear Andrew might overtake us. It's a wonder Sam Mason didn't call up Andrew, I said. He must have looked mighty queer to him for an old farmhand like me to be around, peddling books. He would have done it straight off, said Mifflin, but you see, I cut his telephone wire. Chapter 5. I gazed in astonishment at the wizened little rogue. Here was a new side to the amiable idealist. Apparently there was a streak of fearless devilry in him besides his gentle love of books. I'm bound to say that now, for the first time, I really admired him. I had burnt my own very respectable boats behind me, and I rather enjoyed knowing that he, too, could act briskly in a pinch. Well, I said, you are a cool hand. It's a good job for you that you didn't stay a schoolmaster. You might have taught your pupils some fine devilries, and at your age, too. I'm afraid my raillery goes a little too far sometime. He flushed a bit at my reference to his age, and puffed sharply at his pipe. I say, he rejoined, how old do you think I am, anyway? Only 41 by the bones of Byron. Henry VIII was only 41 when he married Anne Boleyn. There are many consolations in history for people over 40. Remember that when you get there. Shakespeare wrote King Lear at 41, he added more humorously, and then burst out laughing. I'd like to edit a series of chloroform classics to include only books written after 40. Who was that doctor man who recommended anesthetics for us at that age? Now, isn't that just like a medico? Nurse us through the diseases of childhood, and as soon as we settle down into permanent good health and worldly wisdom, and freedom from doctor's fees, why, he loses his interest in us. Jove, I must write that down and bring it into my book. He pulled out a memorandum book and jotted down chloroform classics in a small, neat hand. Well, I said, I felt a little contrite, as I was sincerely sorry to have offended him. I've passed 40 myself in some measurements, so youth no longer has any terrors for me. He looked at me rather comically. My dear madam, he said, your age is precisely 18. I think if we escape the clutches of the sage of Redfield, you may really begin to live. Oh, Andrew's not a bad sort, I said. He's absent-minded and hot-tempered and a little selfish. The publishers have done their best to spoil him, but for a literary man, I guess he's quite human. He rescued me from being a governess, and that's to his credit. If only he didn't take his meals quite so much as a matter of course. The preposterous thing about him is that he really can write, said Mifflin. I envy him that. Don't let him know I said so. But as a matter of fact, his prose is almost as good as Thoreau. He approaches facts as daintily as a cat crossing a wet road. You should see him at dinner, I thought. Or rather, I meant to think it, but the word slipped out. I found myself thinking aloud in a rather disconcerting way while sitting with this strange little person. He looked at me. I noticed for the first time that his eyes were slate blue, with funny bird's foot wrinkles at the corners. That's so, he said. I never thought of that. A fine prose style certainly presupposes sound nourishment. Excellent point, that. And yet Thoreau did his own cooking. Sort of Boy Scout, I guess, with a badge as kitchen master. Perhaps he took beechnut bacon with him into the woods. I wonder who cooked for Stevenson. The Child's Garden of Verses was really a kind of kitchen garden, wasn't it? I'm afraid the commissariat problem has weighed rather heavily on you. I'm glad you've got away from it. All this was getting rather intricate for me. I set it down as I remember it, inaccurately perhaps. My governess days are pretty far astern now, and my line is common sense rather than literary allusions. I said something of the sort. Common sense, he repeated. Good Lord, ma'am, sense is the most uncommon thing in the world. I haven't got it. I don't believe your brother has from what you say. Bach here has it. See how he trots along the road, keeps an eye on the scenery, and minds his own business? I never saw him getting into a fight yet. Wish I could say the same of myself. I named him after Boccaccio, to remind me to read the Decameron some day. Judging by the way you talk, I said, you ought to be quite a writer yourself. Talkers never write. They go on talking. There was a considerable silence. Mifflin relit his pipe and watched the landscape with a shrewd eye. I held the reins loosely, and Peg ambled along with a steady clop-clop. Parnassus creaked musically, and the mid-afternoon sun lay rich across the road. We passed another farm, but I did not suggest stopping as I felt we ought to push on. Mifflin seemed lost in meditation, and I began to wonder a little uneasily how the adventure would turn out. This quaintly masterful little man was a trifle disconcerting. Across the next ridge I could see the Greenbrier church spire shining white. Do you know this part of the country? I asked finally. Not this exact section. I've been in Port Vigor often, but then I was on the road that runs along the Sound. I suppose this village ahead is Greenbrier. Yes, I said. It's about 13 miles from there to Port Vigor. How do you expect to get back to Brooklyn? Oh, Brooklyn? He said vaguely. Yes, I'd forgotten about Brooklyn for the minute. I was thinking of my book. Why, I guess I'll take the train from Port Vigor. The trouble is you can never get to Brooklyn without going through New York. It's symbolic, I suppose. Again there was a silence. Finally he said, Is there another town between Greenbrier and Port Vigor? Yes, Shelby, I said, about 5 miles from Greenbrier. That'll be as far as you'll get tonight, he said. I'll see you safe to Shelby, and then make tracks for Port Vigor. I hope there's a decent inn at Shelby where you can stop overnight. I hoped so, too, but I wasn't going to let him see that with the waning afternoon my enthusiasm was a little less robust. I was wondering what Andrew was thinking, and whether Mrs. McNally had left things in good order. Like most Swedes, she had to be watched or she left her work only 3/4 done. And I didn't depend any too much on her daughter Rosie to do the housework efficiently. I wondered what kind of meals Andrew would get. And probably he would go right on wearing his summer underclothes, although I had already reminded him about changing. And then there were the chickens. Well, the Rubicon was crossed now, and there was nothing to be done. To my surprise, little Redbeard had divined my anxiety. Now don't you worry about the sage, he said kindly. A man that draws his royalties isn't going to starve. And by the bones of John Murray, his publishers can send him a cook if necessary. This is a holiday for you, and don't you forget it." And with this cheering sentiment in my mind, we rolled sedately down the hill toward Greenbrier. I'm about as hardy as most folks, I think, but I confess I balked a little at the idea of facing the various people I know in Greenbrier as the owner of a book van and the companion of a literary huckster. Also, I recollected that if Andrew should try and trace us, it would be as well for me to keep out of sight. So after telling Mr. Mifflin how I felt about matters, I dived into the Parnassus and lay down most comfortably on the bunk. Bach the terrier joined me, and I rested there in great comfort of mind and body as we ambled down the grade. The sun shone through the little skylight, gilding a tin pan that hung over the cook stove. Tacked here and there were portraits of authors, and I noted a faded newspaper cutting pinned up. The headlines ran, "Literary Peddler Lectures on Poetry." I read it through. Apparently the professor, so I had begun to call him, as the aptness of the nickname stuck in my mind, had given a lecture in Camden, New Jersey, where he had asserted that Tennyson was a greater poet than Walt Whitman, and the boosters of the Camden Poet had enlivened the evening with missals. It seems that the chief Whitman disciple in Camden is Mr. Trauble, and Mr. Mifflin had started the rumpus by asserting that Tennyson, too, had Traubels of his own. What an absurd creature the professor was, I thought, as I lay comfortably lulled by the rolling wheels. Greenbrier is a struggling little town, built around a large common meadow. Mifflin's general plan in towns, he had told me, was to halt Parnassus in front of the principal store or hotel, and when a little throng had gathered, he would pull up the flaps of the van, distribute his cards, and deliver a harangue on the value of good books. I lay concealed inside, but I gathered from the sounds that this is what was happening. We came to a stop. I heard a growing murmur of voices and laughter outside, and then the click of the raised sides of the wagon. I heard Mifflin's shrill, slightly nasal voice making facetious remarks as he passed out the cards. Evidently Bach was quite accustomed to the routine, for though his tail wagged gently when the professor began to talk, he lay quite peaceably, dozing at my feet. "My friends," said Mr. Mifflin, "you remember Abe Lincoln's joke about the dog? If you call a tail a leg," said Abe, "how many legs has a dog?" "5, you answer. "No," says Abe, "because calling a tail a leg doesn't make it a leg." Well, there are lots of us in the same case as that dog's tail. Calling us men doesn't make us men. No creature on earth has a right to think himself a human being if he doesn't know at least one good book. The man that spends every evening chewing Piper Heidsieck at the store is unworthy to catch the intimations of a benevolent creator. The man that's got a few good books on his shelf is making his wife happy, giving his children a square deal, and he's likely to be a better citizen himself. How about that, parson? I heard the deep voice of Reverend Kane, the Methodist minister. "You're dead right, Professor," he shouted. "Tell us more about books. I'm right with you." Evidently Mr. Kane had been attracted by the sight of Parnassus, and I could hear him muttering to himself as he pulled 1 or 2 books from the shelves. How surprised he would have been if he had known I was inside the van. I took the precaution of slipping the bolt of the door at the back and drew the curtains. Then I crept back into the bunk. I began to imagine what an absurd situation there would be if Andrew should arrive on the scene. "You are all used to hucksters and peddlers and fellows selling every kind of junk, from brooms to bananas," said the professor's voice. "But how often does anyone come around here to sell you books? You've got your town library, I dare say, but there are some books that folks ought to own. I've got 'em all here, from Bibles to cookbooks. They'll speak for themselves. Step up to the shelves, friends, and pick and choose." I heard the parson asking the price of something he had found on the shelves, and I believed he bought it. But the hum of voices around the flanks of Parnassus was very soothing, and in spite of my interest in what was going on, I'm afraid I fell asleep. I must have been pretty tired. Anyway, I never felt the van start again. The professor says he looked in through the little window from the driver's seat and saw me sound asleep. And the next thing I knew, I woke up with a start to find myself rolling leisurely in the dark. Bach was still lying over my feet, and there was a faint, musical clang from the bucket under the van, which struck against something now and then. The professor was sitting in front, with a lighted lantern hanging from the peak of the van roof. He was humming some outlandish song to himself, in a queer, monotonous refrain. Shipwrecked was I, oft soft carouse, and right along the shore, and so I did resolve to roam the country to explore. Tommy rip fa la and ballum tip, Tommy rip fa la I dee, and so I did resolve to roam the country for to see. I jumped out of the bunk, cracked my shins against something, and uttered a rousing halloo. Parnassus stopped, and the professor pushed back the sliding window behind the driver's seat. Heavens, I said. Father Time, what o'clock is it? Pretty near supper time, I reckon. You must have fallen asleep while I was making money from the Philistines. I made nearly $3 for you. Let's pull up along the road and have a bite to eat. He guided Pegasus to one side of the road and then showed me how to light the swinging lamp that hung under the skylight. No use to light the stove on a lovely evening like this, he said. I'll collect some sticks and we can cook outside. You get out your basket of grub and I'll make a fire. He unhitched Pegasus, tied her to a tree, and gave her a nosebag of oats. Then he rooted around for some twigs and had a fire going in a jiffy. In 5 minutes I had bacon and scrambled eggs sizzling in a frying pan, and he had brought out a pail of water from the cooler under the bunk and was making tea. I never enjoyed a picnic so much. It was a perfect autumn evening, windless and frosty, with a dead black sky and a tiny rim of new moon like a thumbnail paring. We had our eggs and bacon, washed down with tea and condensed milk, and followed by bread and jam. The little fire burned blue and cozy, and we sat on each side of it while Bach scoured the pan and ate the crusts. This your own bread, Miss McGill? He asked. Yes, I said. I was calculating the other day that I've baked more than 400 loaves a year for the past 15 years. That's more than 6,000 loaves of bread. They can put that on my tombstone. The art of baking bread is as transcendent a mystery as the art of making sonnets, said Redbeard. And then your hot biscuits. They might be counted as shorter lyrics, I suppose. Triolets, perhaps. That makes quite an anthology, or doxology, if you prefer it. Yeast is yeast, and west is west, I said, and I was quite surprised at my own cleverness. I hadn't made a remark like that to Andrew in 5 years. I see you're acquainted with Kipling, he said. Oh, yes, every governor is. Where and whom did you govern? I was in New York, in the family of a wealthy stockbroker. There were 3 children. I used to take them walking in Central Park. Did you ever go to Brooklyn? He said abruptly. Never, I replied. Ah, he said, that's just the trouble. New York is Babylon. Brooklyn is the true holy city. New York is the city of envy, office work, and hustle. Brooklyn is the region of homes and happiness. It is extraordinary. Poor, harassed New Yorkers presume to look down on low-lying, home-loving Brooklyn, when as a matter of fact it is the precious jewel of their souls are searching for, and they never know it. Broadway, think of how symbolic the name is. Broad is the way that leadeth to destruction. But in Brooklyn the ways are narrow, and they lead to the heavenly city of content. Central Park, there you are, the center of things, hemmed in by walls of pride. Now how much better is Prospect Park, giving a fair view over the hills of humility. There is no hope for New Yorkers, for they glory in their skyscraping sins, but in Brooklyn there is the wisdom of the lowly. So you think that if I had been a governess in Brooklyn, I should have been so contented that I would never have come with Andrew and compiled my anthology of 6,000 loaves of bread and the lesser lyrics. But the volatile professor had already soared to other points of view, and was not to be thwarted by argument. Of course Brooklyn is a dingy place, really, he admitted, but to me it symbolizes a state of mind, whereas New York is only a state of pocket. You see, I was a boy in Brooklyn, and it still trails clouds of glory for me. When I get back there and start work on my book, I shall be as happy as Nebuchadnezzar when he left off grass and returned to tea and crumpets. Literature among the farmers, I'm going to call it. But that's a poor title. I'd like you to read some of my notes for it. I'm afraid I poorly concealed a yawn. As a matter of fact, I was sleepy, and it was growing chilly. Tell me first, I said, where in the world are we, and what time is it? He pulled out a turnip watch. It's 9 o'clock, he said, and we're about 2 miles from Shelby, I should reckon. Perhaps we'd better get along. They told me at Greenbrier that the Grand Central Hotel in Shelby is a good place to stop at. That's why I wasn't anxious to get there. It sounds so darn much like New York. He bundled the cooking utensils back into Parnassus, hitched Peg up again, and tied Bach to the stern of the van. Then he insisted on giving me $2.80 he had collected in Greenbrier. I was really too sleepy to protest, and of course it was mine anyway. We creaked off along the dark and silent road between the pine woods. I think he talked fluently about his Pilgrim's Progress among the farmers of a dozen states, but, to be honest, I fell asleep in my corner of the seat. I woke up when we halted before the one hotel in Shelby, a plain, unimposing country inn, despite its absurd name. I left him to put Parnassus and the animals away for the night, while I engaged a room. Just as I got my key from the clerk, he came into the dingy lobby. Well, Mr. Mifflin, I said, shall I see you in the morning? I had intended to push on to Port Vigor tonight, he said, but it's fully 8 miles, they tell me. I guess I'll bivouac here. I think I'll go into the smoking room and put them wise to some good books. We won't say goodbye till tomorrow. My room was pleasant and clean, fairly so. I took my suitcase up with me and had a hot bath. As I fell asleep, I heard a shrill voice ascending from below, punctuated with masculine laughter. The Pilgrim was making more converts. So that's the end of the second installment of Parnassus on Wheels by Christopher Morley. Thank you for joining me, and have a very good week.